She overheard the Alpha King describe his perfect mate. Every word was accidentally about her. She wasn't supposed to be there. That was the simple truth of it, the hinge on which everything turned. Sira Voss had not been invited to the War Council. She had not been summoned, or welcomed, or even acknowledged by the guards at the double iron doors of the East Corridor. She had simply followed the smell of a blocked drainage vent, wrench in hand, because the lower kitchens flooded every time it rained and nobody else in this pack bothered to fix anything that didn't involve teeth or territory. The corridor behind the council chamber wall was barely a shoulder-width wide, a maintenance passage built into the bones of Ashfall Keep centuries before anyone living had drawn breath. Sira had used it 100 times. The pack didn't know it existed. Most of the pack didn't know she existed either, which amounted to the same thing. She found the blockage, cleared it, dead leaves and a crushed bird's nest, nothing dramatic, and was working her way back toward the kitchen stairs when she heard the Alpha King's voice come through the stone like it lived there. She stopped. Not because she meant to listen, because the voice was doing something she had never heard it do before. It was uncertain. Selim Ashville was not an uncertain man. He was 34 years old, the largest shifter in 6 territories, and he had killed his predecessor in a dominance challenge before his 22nd birthday. He spoke in complete sentences, and he meant every word, and he never, in Sira's experience, however limited, stumbled over his own thoughts. But he was stumbling now. "I'm not describing a woman," he said, and someone on the other side of the wall, Gareth, his beta, she recognized the low rasp, made a sound that suggested he disagreed. "You've been describing her for 10 minutes, Gareth said. A pause, long enough for Sira to set the wrench down against the stone wall, very quietly, because she had the sudden feeling that moving would be wrong, that this moment was balanced on something she couldn't see, and her footstep might send it all the wrong way. "I'm describing a requirement," Selim said, "for the bond. There are things a Luna needs to be, functionally, for a pack this size. I'm being practical. You said she should smell like clean water and wood smoke. Practically speaking." Selim. Another pause. "Fine," the Alpha said, and his voice had dropped into something that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite surrender, but lived in the country between the two. "I'll say it plainly, if that's what you want. She should be someone who sees what's broken and fixes it before anyone notices it was broken, not because she was asked, because it bothers her to see things left wrong." Sira's hand found the stone wall without her telling it to. "She should be stubborn," he continued. "Not defiant stubborn. There's a difference. Defiance is performance. Stubbornness is just the refusal to accept that something can't be fixed. A brief sound, almost a laugh, almost nothing. She should be infuriating in that specific way, where she's technically correct about everything and has absolutely no idea how that reads to other people." Gareth said something too quiet for the stone to carry. "Small," Selim said, and the word sounded like it cost him something. "Not fragile, small like compact, like everything useful in her has been pressed together until it's denser than it should be." He paused again. "She has a way of being still. Most Omegas, when they're nervous, they get smaller. She gets quieter, like she's calculating. I find it." He stopped. "You find it what?" Gareth asked. "Relevant," the Alpha said. "I find it relevant. For a Luna needs to be able to hold ground without moving." Sira was not breathing. She had been not breathing for some time and was only now noticing. "She has marks on her hands," he said, almost to himself. "Burns mostly, old ones. She works with heat sources and she just doesn't stop working long enough to be careful, it's a problem. But they're part of how I'd know her in the dark." The silence that followed was different from the others. Gareth wasn't filling it, which meant either he had nothing to say or he was very carefully choosing to say nothing, which in a beta amounted to the loudest possible agreement. I have not been describing a specific woman, Selim said. He said it with the flat finality of a man trying to convince a jury that already had its verdict. I have been describing a functional ideal, a construct. The burns on her hands, though, Gareth said. Silence. I am not, the Alpha King said very quietly, saying her name. And Sira, in the dark of the maintenance corridor with her back against cold stone, and her heart doing something it had no business doing, understood. He wasn't saying her name because he already knew it. He had been saying her for 10 minutes without once using the word her. She made it to the kitchen stairs before her legs decided they'd had enough of the performance, and sat her down on the third step, whether she wanted to be sitting or not. Her hands were in her lap and she was staring at them. The old burns, the pale lines of healed skin between her knuckles, the calluses at the base of her fingers from the wrench and the utility knife, and the 1,000 small repairs that made up her days. They were not romantic hands. She knew that. She had always known that. She was not a romantic person generally. She was practical, like he had said, like he had described. She was practical and stubborn, and she had absolutely no idea how she read to other people, which she had always thought was a flaw and he had apparently been thinking about for. She didn't know how long. She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes. The thing was, she knew what she was in this pack. She had known from the first year after her transition, when her Omega designation had come in quiet and undramatic, and had settled the question of her future with the finality of a door closing. Omegas did not become Lunas. Omegas maintained the lower kitchens and repaired the heating systems and kept the pipes from flooding the east wing, and were, in the structural sense, necessary, in the same way that a foundation was necessary, vital, invisible, and never confused for architecture. She was 23 years old, and she had spent 5 of those years learning to be useful without being seen. She had gotten very good at it. She was not supposed to be the answer to a question. The Alpha King didn't know he was asking. She picked up her wrench. She went back to work. She did not allow herself to think about it again until the middle of the night, when she woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of rain, and her first thought was about the East Corridor drainage vent, and her second thought was that he had described someone who woke up at 3 a.m. thinking about drainage vents, and she lay in the dark for a very long time with that thought sitting on her chest like a stone. The morning came with the ordinary weight of things that needed doing. The great hall kitchens were already alive when Sira arrived. The senior cook, Marin, had 3 fires going, and a disposition that suggested she had personally argued with the dawn and lost. 2 of the younger packmates were chopping vegetables with the grim efficiency of people who had somewhere else they'd rather be. The smell of wood smoke was everywhere. Sira ignored the way that made something catch in her chest and went to check the stove manifold, which had been pulling slightly low on the left burner for 3 days. She was under the counter with a torch and a calibration key when she heard the voices. Nira and Dasa, 2 third-ring wolves, ranked, visible, the kind of women who existed in the pack the way sunlight existed, just there, just bright, impossible to overlook. They were standing near the flour bins and they were talking about the War Council. Sira went very still. He spent half the session on the mate question, Nira said. There was a particular kind of relish in her voice, the pleasure of a person with information in a room full of people who want it. Gareth told my mother. Apparently the king actually started describing her, his ideal mate, in front of the full council. What did he say? Small dark hair, Omega. A long pause from Dasa. He wants an Omega Luna. He said he doesn't care about rank. He said, and this is the part my mother could barely repeat with a straight face, he said she smells like clean water and wood smoke and she knows how to fix things. Silence. Then Dasa said, with the precise articulation of someone trying not to laugh, he described Sira. Don't be ridiculous. Nira, the maintenance girl, She smells exactly like that. I've stood next to her. And she fixes things. Literally, she fixes things, that's all she does. She's a nobody, Neera said. The word landed flat and factual, not cruel, which was almost worse. The way certainty bypassed the need for cruelty entirely. The Alpha King doesn't take an Omega Luna. Whatever he said last night, it was abstract. He doesn't even know she exists. Sierra under the counter, with the calibration key in her hand, and a burn scar on her wrist pressed against the cool pipe, kept perfectly still. Neera was right. She knew that. She had told herself exactly that last night in the dark. Whatever he'd said had been abstract, a functional ideal, a construct. He had said so himself. Those were his own words. She was not the shape of those words made flesh. She was a pipe fitter in a very large keep, and she had known her place in this world for 5 years. And she was not going to let 20 minutes in a maintenance corridor dismantle something that had taken her years to build. She went back to calibrating the burner. She did not cry. She was very good at not crying. It was one of the things she was best at. 2 days later, she met him. Not by accident. She never met anyone by accident. She was too careful for that, had trained herself out of being in places where she might be noticed. But the East Wing boiler had developed a pressure fault that was going to rupture a main seal before the week was out, and the boiler room was 3 floors below the Alpha King's private study, and the pressure gauge was audible from the hallway, and apparently he had better hearing than she'd planned for. She was halfway through the regulator adjustment when the door opened. She had her back to it. She was covered in grease up to both elbows. Her hair had escaped its tie and was doing something complicated on the left side of her head. She was, by any reasonable assessment, not presenting herself well. "That's a pressure fault," said the Alpha King. "I know," Sierra said. She didn't turn around. Her hands kept moving, experienced hands, efficient. They'd done this particular fix enough times that thinking about it was almost secondary to doing it. "Main regulator seatings cracked. I've got a replacement seated, but the pressure equalizer needs to bleed down before I can lock it, or the back surge will blow the secondary valve." A pause. "How long?" "4 minutes, if you let me concentrate." Another pause, longer this time, and she was very aware of him in the doorway behind her. The weight of him, the particular stillness that large predators got when they were paying close attention to something small. She concentrated. The pressure gauge climbed, held, began to drop. She watched it with the focused patience of someone who had learned that impatience was just another name for wasted time. And when it hit the mark, she turned the lock ring 3/4 of a turn and felt the satisfying certainty of a seal that had taken properly. "Done," she said. She turned around. He was larger in person than he looked from a distance, which she had always known intellectually, but her body apparently hadn't processed until now, because standing 2 meters from him in a small boiler room was a different kind of information than watching him cross the great hall from the back. He was looking at her hands. "You're the one who maintains this floor," he said. "And the 2 below it." She picked up a clean rag and began working on her fingers. "And the East Wing, and the lower kitchens. There isn't another maintenance tech for the residential levels, so I cover everything between the ground floor and the 4th. Alone." She thought about the right way to say yes, because nobody else will and things need to be kept working without it sounding like a complaint. She said, "The work gets done." He was still looking at her hands. She had the sudden, vertiginous awareness that she had been recognized, not by name, not by rank, but in some more fundamental way, the way a key is recognized by the lock it fits, a soundless functional click. She had the equally vertiginous awareness that she needed to leave this room before that feeling had time to become anything she'd have to dismantle later. "I'll check the secondary valve in 48 hours, she said, and moved toward the door. "What's your name?" he said. She stopped. She had to, because his voice had done something when it asked that question, dropped an octave, lost the formal alpha register, become something she had not heard before from him, something that sounded the way the maintenance corridor had sounded when he said burns and wood smoke and I find it. She turned back. Sira, she said, Sira Voss. He said it back. Just her name, nothing attached to it, like he was confirming something he'd suspected for a long time and was now allowing himself to be certain of. She left. She walked very normally down the corridor and around the corner and 2 more corridors after that before she stopped, leaned her back against the stone, and closed her eyes. Her heart was doing exactly what she had told it, firmly and repeatedly, not to do. The thing about packs was that they had a sense for things. Not a clean sense, not prophecy, not certainty, nothing so neat, more like weather. The way a shift in the air told you rain was coming even before the clouds showed. The pack at Ashfall Keep had noticed something, and they didn't know what it was yet, but they were starting to lean toward it like grass before a wind. Sira noticed when the senior cook started saving her the better portion at meals, without being asked. She noticed when the third-ring wolves stopped walking through her as if she were furniture and started walking around her instead. A small adjustment, barely conscious, but there. She noticed when the Alpha King's beta found reasons to be in her vicinity 3 times in 4 days, always doing something entirely legitimate, always somehow ending up 5 feet from where she was working with a look on his face like a man waiting for something to happen. She noticed all of it, and she dealt with it the way she dealt with everything she couldn't directly fix. She made herself very busy and very useful, and hoped it would pass. It didn't pass. On the 5th day after the boiler room, the elder pack historian, a gray-muzzled woman named Covenant who had lived in the keep for longer than anyone could clearly remember, appeared in the lower kitchens while Sira was bleeding the radiator lines. Sira had always liked Covenant. She had a quality of attention that made you feel seen without making you feel watched, which was a difficult combination to achieve, and Sira had spent years trying to learn it. "I know what you heard," Covenant said. Sira's hand didn't stop moving. "I don't know what you mean." The maintenance passage behind the council chamber wall. Covenant settled herself on a stool with the ease of a very old woman who had stopped pretending that standing was comfortable. "I know you were there. I also know you went back to work afterward and said nothing to anyone, and that you've spent the last 5 days working twice as hard as usual, which is what you do when you're trying to convince yourself that something you know isn't true." "Something I know," Sira said. "He's been looking for you," Covenant said very simply, "for longer than he knows. The bond path opened 8 months ago. I felt it. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place and because he needed to find his own way to the answer. But I want you to understand something, girl." She paused, and her voice got the weight of someone setting down something she'd been carrying for a long time. "There are things in this pack's history that aren't written in the official records. Your bloodline is one of them." Sira looked up. "Your mother was Omega," Covenant said. "Your father was ranked. Specifically, he was Selim's father's beta, which makes your bloodline." "Don't," Sira said. "Pack bonded to the Alpha line. Sira, it doesn't make you ranked. It doesn't change your designation, but it changes what the bond means when it comes." Covenant folded her hands in her lap. The old families understood something that the modern pack has largely forgotten. The bond doesn't cross class lines because it ignores them. It crosses class lines because it was never looking at them to begin with. Sira set the bleeding key down on the floor. She looked at her hands. "He doesn't know any of this," she said. "No. You need to tell him." "I was going to," Covenant said, with a tone that suggested she had planned and been thwarted 3 weeks ago. "Before I did, someone got there first." She was quiet for a moment. Someone who didn't want him to know. The person who didn't want him to know had a name. His name was Ran Velos, and he was the Alpha of the Northern Ridge Territory, and he had been at Ashfall Keep for 6 days as a diplomatic guest, and Sira would not have known any of this if Gareth, the beta, hadn't appeared at her workbench on the morning of the 6th day, with an expression she'd never seen on him before, controlled on the surface and not at all controlled underneath. "Pack your kit," he said, "the small one. The one you can carry." "Why?" "Because Rand Velos knows what you are, and he's going to move before tonight, and we need you somewhere he's not." Sira looked at him for a long moment. She was very good at reading the space between what people said and what they meant, had been reading it her whole life, and what she read in Gareth right now was, "This is real, this is not a drill, the part where you trusted your instincts and stayed small has just ended." She packed her kit. Gareth walked her through the back passages, the ones she knew better than he did, the ones that branched under the keep like roots, the dark artery system that kept this whole place functioning, and that she'd spent 5 years memorizing because you couldn't fix what you couldn't find. He followed her through corridors he hadn't known existed, and she felt, distantly, the irony of a wolf being led through his own territory by the woman who was technically invisible in it. "He recognized you," Gareth said as they moved. "Velos. At dinner 2 nights ago he watched you clear a blocked serving line without being asked while the rest of the kitchen staff was scrambling. He watched you do it, and then he watched Selim watching you, and he exhaled. He has informants, in our pack, old ones. He knew about Covenant's records before she could get to the Alpha." "What did he tell him?" "He told him you were an Omega with a false bloodline claim. That Covenant was going to manufacture a narrative to push you into the Luna position for political reasons." Sira stopped walking. "He told him," Gareth said carefully, "that you had been listening in the maintenance passage deliberately, that it was orchestrated." The stone wall was very cold under her hand. She was pressing her palm against it without having decided to, and the cold was helping her think, which was something she needed right now. "Did he believe it?" she asked. Gareth was quiet. "Gareth, did the Alpha King believe it?" The beta's jaw worked. "He's Selim. He questions everything and trusts nothing until he can verify it. He didn't believe it fully." But he couldn't verify it, didn't believe it fully either, and Velos moved before he could. "Where is Covenant?" "Safe, hidden, but her records, the bloodline documents, Velos got to them first." Sira breathed in, breathed out. The thing was, and this was the thing she came back to, in the cold and the dark, with Gareth watching her and the pack moving above them like weather. The thing was that she was very good at finding what was broken and fixing it before anyone knew it had been broken. She had been doing it for 5 years. She had learned it in necessity, and she had refined it in silence, and she was, right now, the only person in this keep who understood the full dimensions of the problem. The documents were gone. Covenant was hidden. The Alpha King had been fed a story designed to cut the bond before it could complete. And Rand Velos was going to make his move tonight, which meant there was a window, right now, in the space between his certainty and his action, in the maintenance passages and service corridors that he didn't know existed, and that she knew like her own heartbeat. "Take me to Covenant," she said. Covenant's hiding place was a room so deep in the keep's foundation that the stone itself was original, old quarry blocks, rough cut, older than any record in the pack library. The elder was sitting on a folded blanket with a candle and an expression that was not remotely surprised to see Sira. "The documents are gone," Sira said. "The paper documents are gone," Covenant said. "Velos is thorough. He's had practice at this. I'd be surprised if this is the first pack bond he's moved to cut before it could complete." She tilted her head. "But papers are copies, Sira. Copies of things that were remembered before they were written down." "Tell me." So Covenant told her. It took the better part of an hour, and Sira listened with the focused patience she gave to complicated repair jobs, the kind where every piece mattered, and the sequence had to be right, or the whole thing came apart. She asked 6 questions, 3 of which Covenant answered, and 3 of which Covenant said you already know the answer to that one, with the tone of someone who wasn't wrong. When Covenant was done, Sierra sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. "He still might not believe it," she said. "Without the papers." "No," Covenant agreed. "And Velos will have already made whatever argument is most convenient by the time I can get to Selim." "Almost certainly." So I walk into the Alpha King's chambers with nothing but my word, and ask him to choose between a territorial Alpha with documentation and an Omega maintenance tech with a story. "Yes," Covenant said. Sierra looked at her hands. At the burns, the pale lines, the press of honest work laid into the skin over years. "All right," she said. The Alpha King's chambers were on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. She knew because she'd replaced the radiator coil in his sitting room 14 months ago on a Tuesday morning while he'd been at the sparring grounds, which meant she also knew the layout, the weight of the door handle, the small catch in the 2nd floorboard that you had to step over or it would announce you. She stepped over it. He was at the window, standing, not sitting, which meant he hadn't slept, which meant Gareth had told him something after all, or Velos had pushed the timeline, and the Alpha King was doing what he did with problems he couldn't yet solve, standing very still and thinking at them. He heard her anyway. She hadn't made a sound, but he was an Alpha, and she was apparently something to him that his body had known for 8 months before his mind had agreed to catch up, and he turned. His face did something when he saw her that she couldn't name, and didn't try to. "You should have had guards," he said. "I don't need guards," she said. "I need 2 minutes." "Sierra." "He lied to you," she said. Not heated, not desperate, she was past the place where desperation would be useful. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, plainly, with the weight of certainty behind it, because she had checked her facts and the facts were solid. "I wasn't put in that passage deliberately. I was clearing a drain. I've been clearing that drain every time it rains for 3 years. And if you ask Marin in the lower kitchens, she'll tell you the same thing because she's the one who put in the work order the first time." He was very still. "Velos got to Covenant's records because someone in your pack told him they existed," she continued. "That's the first thing worth knowing, and it's a problem you're going to have whether you believe anything else I say or not." She paused. "The second thing is that Covenant's records aren't the original anyway. They're a copy. The original is what she carries, what she's been carrying here." She pressed 2 fingers to her sternum, "for 40 years. And she told me, an hour ago in the Foundation room. You can go talk to her yourself if you want to verify, and I think you should, because I wouldn't ask you to take my word alone for something this significant." Selim looked at her for a long moment. "You're not asking me to believe you," he said. "I'm asking you to verify," she said. "There's a difference." Something moved through his expression that she thought might be the first genuine thing she'd ever seen on it. Not the Alpha register, not the studied calm of a man who had learned to make certainty into a shield. Something underneath all of that, which was tired and uncertain, and had been standing at this window not sleeping for reasons that were possibly not entirely strategic. "He said you were." "I know what he said," Sierra said. "He was accurate about all the facts. I am an Omega. I did listen in the passage. I didn't leave immediately." She met his eyes. "The facts are all correct. The interpretation is wrong." "What's the right interpretation?" She had thought about this moment, had tried to prepare something careful and strategically sound and emotionally appropriate for a conversation with the Alpha King about a bond claim that she had no standing to make by any conventional metric. She had prepared several versions. She had prepared none of them well enough for him looking at her like that. "I heard you," she said, "describe someone you'd been building in your head for 8 months, and every single word fit. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I went back to work, and I've been going back to work for 5 days, and it doesn't fix anything, going back to work. I know what things can be fixed and what things can't in this." She stopped. pressed her burned hands flat against her thighs. I think you know what I'm saying. The Alpha King crossed the room in 4 strides. He stopped a foot from her, which was closer than anyone stood to her, ever, and he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her hands in the boiler room, with the focus of a man confirming what he already knew, which was also how she looked at a fault in a pipe before she named it and fixed it. Your father, he said, was my father's beta. Yes. Covenant told you. Yes. That makes your bloodline. Pack bonded to the Alpha line, she said. I know, Covenant explained it. It doesn't change my rank and I'm not using it as leverage. I want you to understand that. I'm not, she exhaled. I'm not asking for anything. I'm asking you to verify what I've said and make your own decision. That's all. He reached out and took her right hand. Not dramatically. Not like a man staking a claim. Like a man who had been looking at something from across a room for months and was finally allowed to be close enough to see it clearly and was taking his time. His thumb moved across the old burn scar between her knuckles. 8 months, he said quietly. I've been watching you. I told myself I was watching the work, the efficiency of it, the way nothing ever broke twice in the sections you maintained. I told myself it was a quality control interest. That's very practical, she said. I'm being told it wasn't practical. Gareth and Covenant, and apparently the fact that I spent 40 minutes in a war council session accidentally describing you to 6 of my most senior advisors. He looked at her. I didn't say your name. I thought if I didn't say it, then I hadn't said it. That's not how that works, she said. I'm becoming aware of that. He hadn't let go of her hand. She found she didn't want him to. I want to go talk to Covenant. You should. And I'm going to find out who in my pack has been feeding information to Velos. You should do that too. And then, he said, I need to have a conversation with you that doesn't happen in a workroom or a darkened passage or a chamber I got to only because you knew a way in that I didn't. He paused. I need to have it properly. She thought about what properly meant. For a man like him in a situation like this, with a pack that was watching everything right now, she thought about all of it, the way she would think about a complicated repair, mapping the sequence. There's a courtyard, she said. Off the south corridor, 3rd floor. Most of the pack doesn't know it's there. It's not on the official keep maps. There was a wall redesign 150 years ago that blocked the original entrance. The maintenance passage opens onto it from the back. He stared at her. You know the unofficial map of this entire keep, he said. I know everywhere something might break, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a tone that had something in it she had not heard aimed at herself before, something warm and slightly undone. That is, without question, the most useful quality I have ever encountered in a person. She looked at him. I find it, he said very carefully, relevant for a Luna. Her heart did the thing it had told itself, firmly and repeatedly, not to do. They found Velos's informant by morning. It was a 3rd-ring wolf named Corvus who had been slipping information north for 2 years, motivated by a territorial debt owed before Sealam's ascension. The kind of entanglement that lived in the spaces between official records and official memory, in the parts of pack history that weren't written down because no one had thought them worth writing. Gareth handled it with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for something to confirm a suspicion he'd carried for months. Velos himself left the keep before sunrise, which was the choice of a man who understood the mathematics of a miscalculation. The raid he'd planned had been dependent on the bond being cut before it completed, and it hadn't been cut, and the tactical window had closed, and he was smart enough to withdraw rather than press. He left a message. Gareth gave it to Sealam without reading it first, which was either professional discretion or the choice of a man who did not want to know what it said. What it said was, you picked the bottom rung. Don't come crying to me when it breaks under the weight. Selim burned it in the sitting room fireplace and didn't say anything about it for the rest of the day. Sierra found out what it had said from Gareth 3 weeks later, by which time she had already decided she wasn't interested in Veloz's opinion of structural integrity, having fixed more broken things in 5 years than he would encounter in a lifetime. The courtyard off the south corridor was small and stone-floored, and almost entirely enclosed by keep walls, which meant it held heat from the midday sun and stayed warm well into the evening. There was a dormant fountain at its center that had last been operational in a year nobody could remember, and a stone bench along the eastern wall that someone had worn smooth over generations of sitting. Sierra showed him the maintenance passage entrance on the 3rd evening after the Velos situation had resolved, which was when they'd agreed to have the conversation properly. He brought no one. She brought no one. She wore the same work clothes she'd been in when they met in the boiler room, and he didn't seem to notice or care, which told her something she filed away carefully alongside everything else she was learning about him. They sat on the smooth stone bench, and she showed him how the fountain's valve mechanism had ceased from disuse, and he watched her hands the way he'd watched them in the boiler room, and she was beginning to understand that this was just how he paid attention to things that mattered to him, with that quality of focus that most people reserved for things they were afraid of losing. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't." "I believed for approximately 6 hours that what you'd done in that passage was deliberate, that you'd been arranged." "For 6 hours," she said, "and then you stopped believing it." "Because nothing you'd done suggested it." He was looking at the fountain. "I've spent a year watching you work. You are functionally the least manipulative person in this keep. Everything you do is direct. If it's broken, you fix it. If it can't be fixed, you say so. You don't perform." He paused. "The idea that you'd engineered an eavesdrop was inconsistent with everything I'd observed. I should have discarded it faster." 6 hours, she said again. "In the middle of a diplomatic crisis, with a territorial alpha actively feeding you a false narrative. I'm not holding 6 hours against you." He looked at her. "You're very reasonable," he said, with the tone of a man who is identifying a quality he had not previously understood was something he needed. "I'm practical," she said. "There's a difference." "Not always," she admitted. He almost smiled. It was the same almost laugh she'd heard through the wall of the council chamber, the one that wasn't quite humor and wasn't quite nothing, something in between, something private, something she was beginning to think not many people had seen. "I described you to 6 war council members," he said. "I know. Without knowing I was doing it. I know that too. That is," he stopped, ran a hand over his jaw, which was the gesture of a man who was running out of ways to be articulate about something that resisted articulation. "That is not how I normally operate." "I know," she said gently. "I'm not sure what to do with that." She looked at the fountain, at the seized valve, at the years of dormancy that had locked something useful inside immobility, and the fact that it was still there, still sound, still waiting for someone to work the mechanism loose. "You could start," she said, "by telling me something true, not a functional description, not a construct." She glanced at him. "Something you didn't mean to know." The courtyard was warm. The keep walls blocked the wind. Somewhere above them the pack moved through its evening, meals, conversations, the ordinary undramatic texture of lives being lived, and down here it was just the bench and the fountain and the low amber light going copper at the edges. "I know exactly which repairs you've done in the last year," he said. "Not from reports, I noticed. I noticed every time something stopped being slightly wrong in a section of the keep, and he stopped. I went looking for the source. I told myself it was quality control." "You said that before," she said. "I know," he exhaled. "It wasn't quality control, it was," he looked at her, I wanted to know who cared that much, about things that nobody would notice if they stayed broken. She was quiet for a moment. My mother was practical, she said. She always said that the work you do when nobody's watching is the actual work. Everything else is a performance. She looked at her hands. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. I know, he said. He stopped again, let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. That's the part I find the most difficult to be reasonable about. She looked at him. Relevant, she said carefully. Very, he said, extremely specifically. The almost smile again. This time she let herself have the answering one, small and honest and exactly what it was, and she watched him notice it with that focused alpha attention and file it away somewhere he would apparently not stop thinking about. I need to tell you something, he said. Before this goes further, there will be people in this pack and other packs who will say things about this, about rank, about designation, about what a Luna should be. He held her gaze. I want you to know that I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are. I'm not asking you to be bigger or louder or ranked or different. He paused. I am, apparently, asking you to stop maintaining the East Wing alone and in anonymity forever, but that's a practical conversation for another time. She thought about it. She thought about the pack and its weather, the way it was already leaning toward this without knowing why, the way the senior cook saved her the better portion, and the third-ring wolves had started to walk around her. She thought about Covenant in the foundation room with the candlelight on her face saying, "The bond doesn't look at what you think it's looking at." "I'll need to keep working," she said. He blinked, "Of course. I mean, I need to. I can't be someone who doesn't work. I'll go mad within a week if everything in the keep is just fine, and I have nothing to do." "There is never nothing to do," he said, with the certainty of a man who had been watching a single maintenance tech hold a very large building together for a year. "I can promise you that." "Then we're compatible," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "We're compatible," he agreed, and his voice was doing the thing again, the lower register, the thing she'd heard through the stone wall 8 days ago that had sat her down on the staircase and rearranged everything she'd thought she knew about her life. "I've been aware of that for some time." She looked at him in the copper light. "You should have said something," she said. "I didn't know," he said, "how to say something without." He stopped. "I'd built it in my head into something too large to speak. I kept thinking if I found the exact right words." "You don't need exact right words," she said. "You just need honest ones." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then honestly," he said, "I've been watching you fix things for a year, and what I kept thinking every time was that I wanted you to know that I noticed, that someone noticed, that the work wasn't invisible even when you thought it was." She pressed her lips together. She was very good at not crying. She had been doing it for years. She stopped, breathed. "That's the right thing to say." "Then I should have said it earlier," he said. 8 months earlier, she confirmed. He looked briefly pained, processing. "You were describing me to your war council while telling yourself you weren't." "I was processing slowly," he said, with a dignity that was doing its best against impossible odds, and she laughed, a real laugh, unstaged, unguarded, the kind she didn't usually allow herself in company, and watched his face do something with it that she would think about for a long time afterward. He looked in that moment like a man who had found something he hadn't known he'd lost, and recognized it immediately, and was very careful with it. The bond completed at dawn. It was not dramatic, which she suspected suited them both. There were no ceremonies yet. Those would come later, with the pack witness and the formal records, and the things that needed to be made official because the world required official things. What happened at dawn in the stone courtyard with the dormant fountain, and the bench was just the two of them, and the word she'd been carrying since the maintenance passage, and the word he'd been building for 8 months without saying it, and the point where those two things met and recognized each other, and stopped pretending they were separate. Afterward, she fixed the fountain valve. It took about 10 minutes. The mechanism wasn't damaged, just locked by disuse, and once she worked the seal loose and cleared the corrosion from the inlet pipe, the water moved the way it was supposed to, clear and cold, and making the sound water made when it finally found the way it was meant to go. He watched her do it. When she stood up and dusted her hands on her work trousers, he looked at her with that attention again, the focused, filing away kind, and she understood that he was going to be doing that for a long time. She was beginning to think she didn't mind. The south wing secondary heating lines need recalibrating before winter, she said. Tell Gareth, he said, he'll arrange support. I don't need support, I need. Sira. She looked at him. You're the Luna of Ashfall Pack, he said simply, without any particular weight on it, like a thing that had always been true and was just now being said aloud. You'll still fix things. You'll still work. But you will have a team and a budget, and you will not be covering 3 floors and 2 wings alone anymore. She thought about it. The part of her that had learned to be small and invisible bristled, the way it had bristled for 5 years at the idea of being noticed. And then the other part, the part that woke up at 3 a.m. about drainage vents and had spent a year being recognized by a man who watched her work from across the room and thought it was quality control. That part let it go. Fine, she said. Fine, he agreed. The fountain ran clear in the morning light. The courtyard was warm. Somewhere in the keep, the pack was waking up to the first day of something it had been leaning toward for months without knowing what it was. And Sira stood in the courtyard with burns on her hands and grease on her wrists, and the Alpha King of Ashfall looking at her like she was something he'd finally been allowed to be certain of. She was not, she reflected, what any of them had expected. She was exactly what he'd described. She thought that was probably enough.